Hello, I'm delighted to welcome you to this side event of the 5th Mission Innovation Ministerial event. And many thanks to the ministers and to the organising team for the opportunity to bring together such an eminent panel today to discuss the important topic of innovation for zero carbon cities. I'm Kathy Oak. I'm a special advisor to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy on the Innovate for Cities program. This initiative defines and addresses cities' knowledge and innovation opportunities and creates partnerships between the scientific and academic communities, businesses and governments to overcome the challenges local governments face between the publicly reported ambition and full-scale implementation. With cities responsible for 80% of global GDP and 75% of energy-related carbon emissions, resilient and zero net cities are necessary to maintain a climate safe world, while also offering countries a competitive advantage in attracting global talent and investment and promoting social innovation and well-being. In order to ensure the necessary emissions reduction pathways are achieved, cities must be at the forefront of the design of innovative, citizen-centered solutions to improve and/or reduce the ways energy is used in city-specific context. Innovation in both technology, policy, and investment will be at the heart of a successful transition. With that in mind, this session will explore how increased investments in clean energy research, development, and deployment in cities could drive citizen-focused, innovation-driven action to accelerate the energy transition necessary for a net zero and climate resilient world. This dialogue will explore how unprecedented levels of recovery funding can be invested in resilient, low carbon, holistic solutions that combine all kinds of innovation. And it's a really excellent panel that we have for you today. They're going to look at innovation from technological, digital, social, nature-based, cultural, financial, all kinds of innovation that drive synergies between the existing pipeline of innovative solutions and research and known city needs. Challenges and priorities for a sustainable, resilient future will also be covered. We know that to fully realize our climate and clean energy commitments, that cities and governments and the private sector need to work together, and that the international platforms like Mission Innovation are essential. So let's go to our session now. We will hear each from our excellent panelists, after which there'll be a short amount of time for questions from the audience. So let me introduce the first speaker. Patrick de Woost has been successfully launching consumer services, software startups, technology ecosystems, and corporate transformation programs. His innovation-driven expertise spans both private and public sectors, where Philippe is recognized as a senior advisor and an inspiring speaker on digital sovereignty. He will present today on technology and energy for cities of the future. The floor is now yours, Philippe.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Welcome to everybody. I'm thrilled to be in charge of addressing some opening remarks about technology and energy for cities of the future. So let's start with the first slide and let's start reflecting on the future itself. The slide shows maybe the where and reflects on the whens about this transition towards responsible cities and cities outside our sphere. Yet our main challenge is now. Next slide, please. And our main challenge is now just because the real question indeed is not the where nor the when, but the for whom. And we are all doing this, and all this makes sense only because we are doing things for them and for the next and young generation. We can all realize that almost as of today, this young generation is moving its hunger from connectivity to energy. Before that, everybody was looking for Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi passwords whenever they arrived somewhere. Now with the 4G and soon 5G networks, this is becoming a question of the past. And everybody entering a conference room right now is just desperately looking for outlets in order to recharge. And that's a shift that we'll need to take into account when we talk to them and we address the needs and the future of the next generation to come. When talking about generations, next slide, please, we need also to remember that their perception of the world we're in has been shrinking a lot just because of acceleration. It took us several generations to domesticate language, actually 1700. It took us more than 300 generations to master writing and to exchange information through writing. Gutenberg revolution actually crossed just 35 generations, but still those people were capable of exchanging together between grandparents, parents, and children. And we must admit the fact that now, if we want to reason about the future and about these transitions, the changes we are facing are intra-generational, which will require an even more tremendous effort of sharing, explaining, and discussing with our kids, because they do not live in the same world than what we think we are living in. Next slide, please. This being said and set, I would just like to observe when it comes to technology that the technology energy footprint is just becoming something we can grasp and seize and understand. Because for long, there were more rumors than facts when it came to energy consumption of the tech sector. In a way, we are starting to see the emergence of what some people already called a seventh continent, where for the moment it's estimated that 4%, more than 4% of the primary energy is consumed. And likewise, the technology sector is generating more than 4% anthropic greenhouse gas emissions. So I would like now to focus, next slide please, not so much about production or transition across zero carbon energy sources, just because this has been and will be discussed for long, including about the pros and the cons of nuclear energy. My thoughts and what I would like to share with you and the audience are more coming towards how to make responsible usage of energy something possible. And what we see is that to make this happen, we need to make a huge effort, just because energy consumptions, when it is translated, for example, into your electricity bill, is something absolutely intangible. The only thing you see when you check your electricity bill again is just a price and taxes. There is no way for you to correlate this price and taxes to a usage, just because it's everywhere, and again, not tangible, not commensurable. So it's extremely difficult to compare energy usage. And this is where we absolutely need, if we want to accelerate this transition, to make energy measurement and individual contributions to energy shifting something that can be seen, measured, audited. And what we think is more and more is that the right scale to operate this is the city. And I would like to take just two examples of how to make this consumption more visible. The first one is SmartB, that is deploying blockchain technology in order to make sure that kilometers performed on an electric bike are counted only once, while preserving the anonymity and the privacy of the person who was on the bike. And that is one of the possibilities for mayors to accumulate and to combine all these electric kilometers together and to turn them into carbon credits, and even to trade them on the carbon credit markets. But the only way to make this tradable is to make sure it has not been counted twice, and that there is no risk of double spending in the value and in the trade chain. The next slide will show you another example of how you can be making energy more tangible by tracing green energy provenance. Most of cases, when somebody sells you green energy, what they sell you actually is the promise that at some time within European boundaries, a carbon credit has been purchased, usually from one of the northern countries and from a windmill. But there is no word about when or where this energy was produced. Again, a wonderful technology called blockchain can actually be of precious help when it comes to trace half an hour by half an hour the provenance of your energy in real time, and where in terms of distance, and also how in terms of the sources it has been generated. Next slide, please. So those two examples should also remind us of a very specificity of a city. A city is actually a combination or even a fragile balance between stocks. Think, for example, stocks of people piled in buildings, stocks of food being distributed to people, stocks of goods that they can purchase, but also about flows. And if you disbalance this fragile equilibrium between stocks and flows, you end up congesting the cities beyond what they would need, or you end up making it difficult for cities to circulate, for people to circulate. And remember that things that circulate are likely like blood. I mean, you need circulation to make life spread and make life move from end to end within a body, within an organism. So this being said, and again, these are just opening remarks, I will end with one last slide, because when you talk about, so next please, when you talk about future, when you talk about innovation, when you talk about technology, we are usually dreaming of things happening smoothly everywhere in the world. And I love to quote this sentence from William Gibson in The Neuromancer, reminding us that the future is actually here in the present, as I said very early, I mean, at the beginning of my talk. But it's just not very evenly distributed, meaning that we must make sure that we detect very early where the future, where technology originates. We must make sure that it can spread as quickly as possible. And it's our duty as citizens and as officials to make sure also that it can really reach everybody and that nobody is left on the side of the road. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippe, very much. And next up, we have Patrick Child joining us. Patrick is the Deputy Director General the Deputy Director General in DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission. He leads the policy for implementation, impact and sustainable investment strategies, and is acting director for the Clean Planet. He will present on carbon neutral cities and EU viewpoint. The floor is yours, Patrick.
Kathy, thanks very much. And I'm really happy to be part of this Mission Innovation Ministerial side event. Our Commissioner, Maria Gabriel, was very happy to participate in last week's ministerial meeting, which I think has given us a very strong sense of direction for the next phase of the work of Mission Innovation. And I think that the benefit of this session is to focus on how we can develop further the very important agenda of clean energy innovation in cities as part of this ongoing work. And I wanted to start by really thanking the Global Covenant of Mayors, not only for the organization of this event, but for your lasting commitment to working with us, both at a European level and at a global level in mission innovation. And in speaking to you today, I just really wanted to touch on three main messages. Firstly, the importance of cities as a key vector in our collective efforts towards climate neutrality. Secondly, to highlight a little bit what we are doing at the level of the European Union, and in particular in our next research and innovation framework program, Horizon Europe, which will start at the beginning of next year, to support an active agenda of innovation in cities, particularly around a specific mission. And then thirdly, to talk a little bit about the international dimension and the potential that we see for the next phase in mission innovation to bring this important debate forward at a global level. So on my first point, the importance of cities in addressing climate neutrality, Kathy, you've highlighted the key figures. I mean, cities which account for only 3% of land use in the Earth, yet producing over 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And in Europe, we have close to 85% of citizens be living in cities by 2050. And I think that same trend of majority and of populations concentrated in urban areas is replicated around the world and moving very fast. And that's why I think it is increasingly necessary for us to look at the role of cities and the implications for cities of the clean energy transition. We need new technologies, as Philippe has said, but we need to go well beyond that and have also innovation in public policy, investment vehicles, and low carbon procurement processes. I mean, if we think about the scale of the challenges that we're facing in addressing sustainability and climate change, that will have profound socio-economic implications. But not only we need to be ensured that we are not leaving anyone behind, but also that we are addressing head-on the social and economic consequences of these transitions, as well as equipping ourselves as best we can with the necessary new technologies. And that perhaps brings me to my second main point, which is about what we are doing in the European Union to address these challenges in cities in the context of our research and innovation framework program. So our next framework program, which will be in force from 2021 to 2027, one of the exciting new dimensions is that we are articulating a lot of what we're doing around a number of headline missions. And one of the mission areas that we've been working on is on clean and smart cities, or climate neutral and smart cities, with the objective of having 100 cities across the European Union fully carbon neutral by 2030, and then building on that to take us to the full carbon neutrality, which is foreseen by the European Green Deal by 2050, and with this very important headline goal that this commission under President van der Leyen has set of making Europe carbon neutral by 2050. Many, but not all, climate-friendly and smart technologies already exist that will help us to make the green and digital transition happen. We have barriers that we also need to overcome, as I've said, not only technological, but also societal. And a strategic commitment to urban climate neutrality requires, as Philippe has said, a holistic and integrated approach that brings together stakeholders across energy-intensive sectors, governments, and the research and innovation community. And we need to connect with different initiatives from business, industry, policy, research, and the non-profit sectors. And so with this mission for climate neutral and smart cities in Horizon Europe, we intend to produce both traditional technology-driven approaches with this holistic mission approach for cities and other societal challenges. And this cities mission is coming on top of other areas we're working on, ranging from clean oceans to beating cancer, to soil use and the way that we produce sustainable agricultural production. And we're hoping to explore innovative and customized financial solutions, including blending of traditional grant funding with new innovative financial instruments. And one of the keys we see to the success of this new mission concept is to engaging our citizens in a deep and lasting behavioral change, in particular in cities where they and users, producers, consumers of owners of buildings and transport means, and of course, directly actors in our overall energy system. So a very exciting new dimension at European level around this climate neutral and smart cities agenda. And so I think the question then is, well, what can we bring from that to the discussion at an international level. And that is perhaps a natural transition to my third point, which is about the potential that we see in mission innovation to take this discussion forward. And as I said in my introduction, we're really happy to have the Global Covenant of Mayors as a key partner of mission innovation, and also working closely with us on the development and implementation of our Horizon Europe cities mission. And with your amazing potential of outreach to more than 10,000 cities globally, I don't think that we could achieve much without your support. Under the European Union's European Green Deal, we have a strong focus in our proposals that were adopted in 2019 on the importance of international cooperation and outreach. And we see mission innovation with its key objective of accelerating clean energy transition as a very effective platform for us to pursue this global outreach on the priorities of the European Green Deal. Our President, Ursula von der Leyen, mentioned in her State of the Union speech just a few days ago, underlined our commitment to become the first carbon neutral continent by 2050, and set an even more challenging objective of accelerating Europe's climate goals to achieve a net 55% reduction in global in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And we're encouraged to see that other international players around the world are also stepping up their efforts in support of this important challenge. We see that this is a trend which is also well reflected among urban communities, with many leading mayors and cities around the globe committing themselves to full decarbonisation, and a sort of, even a sort of competitive flavour to who can be the first major cities that achieve full decarbonisation, and this is very, very encouraging. And it brings me to the conclusions of last week's Mission Innovation Ministerial meeting with, I think, a unanimous sense among the countries and partner organizations in mission innovation that we have a really historic opportunity to raise our level of ambition in mission innovation to even higher goals for the future. And I personally hope that this will provide us with an opportunity to develop further our collaboration with the Global Covenant of Mayors and with cities around the globe in support of the clean energy transition. And I think that the event today that we're sharing will give us a really good platform and a rich set of ideas to work with. And so just to conclude in thanking you all for your attention, thanking again the Global Covenant for organising this event, my three messages: that cities are going to be absolutely central in our collective effort towards sustainability and climate change, that the European Union, with its future Horizon Europe programme and our mission on climate neutral and smart cities, will make, we hope, a very powerful contribution to this overall effort. But really, ultimately, success will depend on the success of our international collaborations, like the excellent partnerships that we are developing in mission innovation. And I look forward to working with all of you to take that further forward in future. Thanks very much, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And certainly the Global Covenant of Mayors is certainly very appreciative of the partnership with Mission Innovation, and look forward to further collaboration. And I'll leave the discussion to the end, but certainly a lot to discuss there, especially around the mission for climate neutral cities that you've just described. So next we'll hear from Seth Schultz. Seth is currently serving as the Executive Director of the Resilience Shift. With over 20 years of experience working internationally on issues of the environment, sustainability, and climate change, Seth has helped create global organizations such as the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, the Streets for All Coalition, the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, and the Coalition for Urban Transitions, just a few. Seth will present on transforming ports. The floor is yours, Seth.
to be here with all of you today, especially some good friends and colleagues from Mission Innovation and the Global Covenant of Mayors. Delighted to be joining you here today. And thanks again for allowing me to participate in a really important topic. And I just found out that I believe this is the last session, closing side event, closing out MI5. So fantastic. If you could bring up my slides, please. I did want to dive into an interesting angle of this. So we've heard some of the urgency and the importance of the cities in achieving our carbon neutral societal outcomes by mid-century, as well as the importance in the shift in that energy. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do is zoom in a little bit on a project that we've just got up and going at the Resilient Shift. The Resilient Shift is an organization. We work to shape, practice, share learning, and influence policy, particularly around sustainable infrastructure. Go to the next slide, please. And we're diving into this issue and trying to understand how we can help accelerate this shift to a carbon neutral society, particularly around cities. And we're zeroing in on ports. Ports are actually, it's a really interesting place-based example of these linchpins that can unleash a lot of innovation and advancement. But a couple of quick statistics for those who might not be familiar. Ports actually in shipping particularly emit around 800 megatons of CO2. It's in perspective similar to Germany or Japan in terms of global emissions. There's also a massive amount of investment that needs to happen and is already happening in the shipping industry, $1 to $2 trillion investment to decarbonize it. And there's also a lot of health issues around shipping, 60,000 deaths every year, over $330 billion in health costs. And then let's not forget the importance of the global trade that the maritime freight industry plays in the global economy. We saw this particularly around COVID-19 when some of our supply chains were disrupted so critically. Next slide, please. So in particular, what we work on and focus on the Resilient Shift is critical infrastructure, particularly four sectors: transport, energy, water, and communications. With an understanding of how interconnected those particular sectors of infrastructure are, and that really a failure in one of those creates a cascading potential failure in all the underlying infrastructure connected. And ports sits right across all of this. And thinking about how ports are connecting land to sea and connecting not just a geopolitical kind of boundary, but a user boundary is quite of a lot of interest to us. And in particular, how we can help zoom in on particular cities who have these ports to bridge literally the energy transitions that we need to take. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick example. I know that the slide is small. This is really just to illustrate the point here, but this is a zoom in on ports and energy flows in the United Kingdom. Quite interestingly enough, a large portion of the ports are dominated by the import and export of natural gas and petroleum and refined products for the use of maritime diesel, ship bunkering, etc. You can see the energy breakdown here. Next slide, please. And if we think about what the role of ports and cities are going to be in changing to a net zero emissions or carbon neutral outcome, you can start seeing the interconnected nature and how critical ports play in this system, this energy system. And that's really important because to understand how we start doing this, we have to have a very holistic viewpoint, and we have to understand how interconnected these systems are. And then look at them within that system, not just within the silo, and begin connecting the policies and the opportunities from maritime shipping to ports to cities. And you can see here is allow this transition to start happening. Ports are particularly going to start looking into the hydrogen economy, the use and export of LNG, liquid and natural gas, for use for CCS in power systems and generating blue hydrogen, and for the export of captured carbon from an industry, which are also oftentimes located on coasts and near ports. Next slide, please. So in particular, within this idea of helping cities achieve carbon neutrality, and then zooming in on the ones that have this port infrastructure that the larger country or region depends on, we also want to zoom in on, particular for the purposes of today's discussion, the emerging hydrogen economy, the importance of it, particularly around conversion of natural gas, as I mentioned, the export of carbon capture, as well as the import and export of hydrogen itself. And you can see now as this transition starts happening, it's not quite as simple as you think. As a quick example of this, as particular ports in cities start making investments to transition the port infrastructure, their tank farms, their shipping, their docking, their land-based rolling infrastructure, etc. These investments need to happen in site-specific places and contexts, but the ports are connected to this broader ecosystem of ports up and down that region, that coast, etc., as well as the shipping industry. So if a port changes and starts updating its infrastructure but is out of step with what the shipping industry is doing, or the ports that are across either the Pacific or the Atlantic, there isn't uniformity and continuity, and it creates disruption. And as we know, the marketplace is not like disruption, nor does industry. Go to the next slide, please. And there's some really exciting things happening around hydrogen particularly, which is why we're pulling on this thread to understand what's happening in terms of ocean maritime ports and land-based. It's really turning into a globally traded energy commodity, such as what we've seen happen with sun and wind. It's really getting countries who have these types of resources to be thinking and looking about this differently. I'm showing here up on the upper right-hand side a map where there's likely exporters and likely importers, just so you can see where the balance of this is looking. This is pulled from a recent IEA Future of Hydrogen research paper. And there's also some really exciting work happening by the European Union and the Green Deal, which Patrick had just mentioned previously, in terms of increased partnership, particularly with the African continent. And Kathy, our moderator and host from Australia, also will be very familiar with the large-scale export industry that is working in terms of ports in the maritime industry in Australia. Next slide, please. So ports themselves, as I've just outlined, are going to be undergoing a pretty significant step change in how the energy is generated, distributed, stored, and used. And again, what's really fascinating about ports and port cities is where that energy and that infrastructure systems are stored and used, the policy arrangements and influence that ports and cities have on each other. Not all ports are owned and operated by cities. Ports actually represent a very interesting and compelling challenge as it pertains to the governance. Some are largely privately owned, some are state or national government run, some are completely owned and operated by their cities, and most of them are somewhere in between. And in terms of, again, resilience and what we're thinking about in terms of cohesion and guiding this innovation and step change together, it requires a lot of coordination between multiple levels of government, the private sector, and industry. And we believe port cities can be right at the heart of this. Next slide, please. So here's just a quick example too. This isn't all, I love the comment earlier from Felipe that, the future that we think is happening is actually right in front of us. It's one, making sure that we understand it, implement it, and help ensure that there's the least amount of disruption and the most amount of opportunities to encourage the step change. But there's numerous Northern European countries already pushing hydrogen strategies, including hydrogen valleys with ports as key hubs. So we're hoping that a program and a focus on this that can tie together some of Mission Innovation's previous and existing missions around hydrogen, around a focus on cities and around shipping, can really be tied together through a look at some of the leading port work in the world. Next slide, please. And then I mentioned previously, too, the importance of systems thinking, but how significant a role cities and city administrations can have. Through the work of the Global Covenant of Mayors and other city networks, cities have been at the vanguard of climate change policy with an awareness of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving air quality, etc. And there's a lot that city and city administrations can share and teach ports who are now looking to do this in more significant ways. And at the same time, there's been a tremendous amount of work and innovation and technology advancements in ports over the last 10 to 20 years, particularly around robotics and artificial intelligence. And there's a lot that can be learned from cities on behalf of ports. So thinking again about what we need to do here, not in terms of silos of only ports or only cities or only shipping, but looking at all of that together and what the interplay between these actors, these groups need to be is really important. And if we do that right, we can help stimulate economic growth, find new jobs, have ports and cities become test beds for innovation, both in digital and tech, while achieving our carbon neutral outcomes by mid-century. Next slide, please. And here we're just further breaking this down. And again, we want to look at the spatial boundary of the operational influence of these systems rather than the political or administrative. And this is just an illustration. You can start seeing here now in some more detail the flows and the connections between port communities, city energy systems, the port itself, and the shipping of the vessels, and the interdependencies that they rely sometimes unknowingly on each other about. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, really what we're putting forward is an idea that ports can be a window to enacting and enabling the transition that we want for low carbon or zero carbon outcomes in cities, as well as this ports and the cities that they represent actually being a step change for the entire region and allowing the generation, distribution, and interconnected nature of the clean energy systems that are rapidly emerging onto the scene to be facilitated in a way that brings this about in the time frame that we need. This is just an illustration now of how we see this all coming together and hope to stimulate this. So as I mentioned before, we're now just kicking off a pilot program on this. We're convening a stakeholder group workshop over the next 2 months and plan on kicking off this initiative with 10 to 20 different ports and their affiliated cities in the beginning of next year. So hopefully I didn't go through that too fast, Kathy, but I want to leave ample time for us all to discuss and hopefully have given a very good, specific example building on the previous two speakers of how we can achieve all of this.
Thank you so much, Seth. Absolutely. Even though, absolutely. They're all very much connected, and I'm always interested in the next big project that you're working on, Seth, and that is very exciting. So I'm now very pleased to introduce another great friend of the Global Covenant of Mayors, Aroma Revi. Aroma is the founding director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. He is a global practice and thought leader and educator with over 35 years of interdisciplinary experience in sustainable development, global environmental change, long-term futures, governance, policy, public finance, urbanization. Aroma is one of the world's leading experts on global environmental change, especially climate change. And he's a coordinating lead author of the 2018 IPCC Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Aroma is going to now present on the summary for urban policymakers. The floor is now yours, Aroma.
Thank you, Kathy. So I'm going to sort of speak to the science that underlies a lot of this things that we've heard over the last half an hour or so from all of our colleagues. I will be describing a very interesting and rather rushed initiative that a number of us were involved in of pulling together not only the science from the special report on 1.5 that I was a part of, especially the critical chapter on implementation, but also bringing together a whole range of stakeholders, including many people in this conversation, to try and understand what it means for urban policymakers. So if I can have the next slide, please. So this is based on one of the most important scientific reports of 2018, the IPCC 1.5 report, which was based on over 6,000 studies, took us almost 2 years to put together, and it received remarkable responses from across the world. Over 30,000 sort of media articles across the world on that. And the idea was, how does one make climate science accessible to policymakers in a post-Paris world? Next slide, please. So this is the summary for urban policymakers. It's available. You can go to the 1.5C site. You'll see it as additional materials there. It's basically synthesized work that's been happening in the IPCC and the climate community over the last 7 to 10 years. 18 of us who brought together all of the chapters of the 1.5 report, looking at mitigation, adaptation, the linkage to sustainable development. And the interesting thing is, unlike a lot of the scientific processes that the IPCC is involved in, it brought together city advisors, city networks, and a range of NGOs to enable urban policymakers access to the latest science. And as I understand it, this report has been fairly influential in many parts of the world of really bringing the science in touch with people who are working to implement it, whether it's mayors or people who are actually helping implement process. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of what we said in the 1.5 report. The most obvious thing that's become sort of very well known knowledge just now is the world is currently at about 1 degree C above the pre-industrial average, where we're warming at about 0.2 degrees C per decade. You just have to do the maths and you'll figure that we will sort of reach 1.5 certainly by the late 2030s, in spite of the slight slowdown in COVID. Next slide. So what are the risks of impacts between 1.5 and 2? Because I think the new thing that we've said in this report is the earlier sort of guardrail was 2 degrees centigrade, but we're saying that 1.5 is actually sort of dangerous climate change. Just a few quick examples. About 350 million people are expected to be exposed to deadly heat waves in megacities. A very worrying concern is that if you do reach 2 degrees, maybe about 400 million people will be affected by food yield reductions. Next slide, please. About 600 million people to be affected by water stress, and directly because of, it's not really going to be sea level rise at the moment, but certainly coastal flooding. So about anywhere between 30 and 80 million people affected by that. So we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, depending on the kind of risk that we're going to be exposed at if we go beyond that 1.5 barrier. Next slide, please. So what do we actually do with this? And in a sense, we were hearing the articulation of that from many of our colleagues in this panel. 4 big transitions that unfortunately have to be implemented simultaneously. If we had done this at the time of Rio, a long time ago, almost 30 years ago, we could have looked at a trade-off, but now we have to do all 4 of them simultaneously. The energy system transition that we've heard a lot about just now, the industrial transition, which is a little bit more complex, the land and ecosystem transition, which essentially provides us ecosystem services, the food and the critical supports that all societies and cities need to survive, and finally the pivotal transition, the urban and the infrastructure system transition, which will make all of this possible. Next slide. The interesting thing that I think we have to note here is most of these transitions do require at least some amount of carbon dioxide removal. And of course, if there's significant overshoot and the overshoot lasts for a long period of time, one will require very significant CDR. The real challenge, I think, in urban areas is that we understand a lot about mitigation. We understand a fair amount about adaptation, but I think the really interesting opportunity for us, both on the science, the policy, and the implementation side, is how we can look at urban areas as places in which significant CDR and storage can actually take place. This is, I think, one of the most critical questions for innovation in the next 2 or 3 decades. Next slide, please. So why do cities matter? Next slide. Cities matter because they're places of opportunity, places of enterprise and hope among poverty, places of productivity amongst deep inequality. So lots of these very interesting sort of dialectical questions that are there. Places of contest for a better life. And as we speak at the moment, places where COVID-19 will be addressed, because this is in some senses a pandemic that started in cities in one place and has spread across the world. But I guess the challenge for us is, or the question for us is, are these places in which a climate transformation can actually be made? And that's what I think we're all sort of looking forward to. Next slide. So why do cities matter? Obviously, because the bulk of the world's population is going to be living in them, but also we're going to increase our urban populations by somewhere between 2.5 and 3 billion, but in particular geographies. In Asia, particularly South Asia, and in sub-Saharan Africa. The other thing that most people don't know is we're also going to see dramatic land use cover changes because of urban expansion, something that has never been seen before in the history of urbanization. So urban expansion could create these catalytic opportunities using new technologies, building and infrastructure that we've heard about to deal with future climate change. Next slide, please. So what can cities do? Of course, cities can do a whole range of things, but I will focus on 2 things. One, of course, is accelerating technological innovation and lifestyle changes, because there's so many of us that are in these places which in a sense concentrate our opportunities, concentrate our potential. And these, there are a number of things we can do here. We can, these innovations can be amplified by the densification that's there. Consumption and resource use patterns can change because people are sort of impacting each other by the actions that they take. And of course, I think the central question on this, and this is a big shift in the science, we have increasing scientific evidence to show that lifestyle choices are real, they can be made, and there are a whole range of enabling conditions for them. And of course, COVID has showed us that there can be dramatic changes in urban environments, in overall environmental conditions, if people actually consume less. Of course, not by impoverishing them, by putting hundreds of millions of people outside jobs, but there's certainly a possibility of doing that. Next slide, please. Could I have the next slide? So one of the core questions we addressed, and we looked at a tremendous amount of literature for this, is to really understand whether the urban transition is feasible. In the whole process of innovation, one of the critical elements is to see from a whole range of new ideas whether these interventions could be feasible. So we looked at it in a multidimensional frame, looking at institutional feasibility, economic feasibility, social-cultural feasibility, and of course, environmental feasibility. Next slide. So what are the sort of feasible options that were looked at and seem like they're interesting from global literature? You can see here a whole range of mitigation options, pretty obvious in some senses: solar PV, bioenergy, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, better public transport, low energy buildings, reduce food wastage, and of course, urban planning. So when you start bringing all of these agendas together, and that's where the real opportunity and challenge is, you really are going to see the beginning of these system transitions. Next slide. But of course, adaptation is very critical because many of these impacts are already starting to happen. And if we're sort of overrun and go beyond 1.5, hit 2, and maybe even higher than that, we really have to depend on adaptation. Here are a set of half a dozen adaptation options that we've talked about there, including dealing with agriculture, green infrastructure, and appropriate building codes and standards. Next slide, please. So the question then is, we know that there are a whole range of options that are feasible. How can they be made possible in a fairly accelerated point of time, hopefully within this decade? Next slide. I guess the most critical thing is, and we know that, enhance access to innovation, and this is what this debate is all about, technology and finance. These are the three critical things that are sort of important to sort of get things growing and accelerate climate action. Of course, this requires effective governance. It requires the engagement of local and regional government. This is a big shift in some senses because a lot of innovation, at least big innovation in science and a whole range of other initiatives, have been led by national governments. But this is a new form of partnership that we really have to examine. A lot of the operational innovation is happening at local and regional government level. And of course, strong political leadership to overcome a whole range of barriers, especially in the policy space. Next slide, please. Climate education is very important because that's the only way that we can accelerate behavior change. The choices that individuals and hence the entire supply chains that sit behind them would make as far as their products, their processes are concerned. We need well-functioning legal frameworks because that becomes a critical impediment, especially in the global south. And of course, rapid technological process using general purpose technologies. We can't only do one thing at the same time. So obviously things like ICT, AI, IoT, etc. are going to be important, but we have to deal with questions of access, of asymmetry, and other challenges that we face in a deeply divided world. Next slide, please. So how could this be paid for? Now, unfortunately, the good thing, of course, is that we got Paris, but the amount of resources that were put together in Paris was actually quite limited. So we're talking about 100 billion. That was tough enough as part of the negotiation. But the estimates that we put together in the 1.5 report talk about something of the order of about $2.5 trillion a year as the annual average investments we need over the next 20 years to make this transition possible. So what does that mean? Does it mean that we're all going to draw most of the sort of discretionary resources in the hands of government? But one must look at it, I guess, in another way, and that is that this is one of the most significant opportunities to be able to create new markets, to create new wealth, and of course to create tremendous new employment, and that's what I guess the new Green Deals are about. But of course, one has to be cautious about this, because financing 1.5C cannot be done through a single approach. That's certainly beyond the fiscal capacity of almost all countries in the world, and of course particularly so for the cities at risk, because cities themselves are not so well resourced. We really need to redirect both the national and the global and the local financial systems, and we need to reimagine global and local financial frameworks, because in some senses they are the most significant challenge to where the resources exist, and they do exist, and where the challenges actually lie. Very often, as I said, the big transitions will be made in the cities of the global south. There it becomes quite challenging. Next slide, please. So what can we learn from this report? Next slide. Quick conclusions. The impacts and the solutions to the climate challenge will be experienced by over 8 billion people in the next decades. And of course, within that, about 5 billion of us will be living in cities and urban areas. Unchecked, climate change will be catastrophic to global and local ecosystems, undoing much of the economic and social progress that we've seen over the last 70 odd years. Now, I think in some senses, COVID is a reminder of, or a precursor of what will happen if we really go beyond 1.5 and beyond 2. There's a serious issue there. So to limit this requires rapid and far-reaching system transitions. It's not a question of this technology or that, or a particular innovation in one place. It requires rapid and far-reaching system transitions in 4 different areas: energy, land, urban, and industrial systems, linked to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because remember, poverty and inequality are some of the most deep challenges, especially energy poverty in many parts of the world. And this will require immediate action across multiple sectors and multiple levels. Next slide, and that's my last slide. So basically, successful city-level climate action will require strategies at work, but city action alone will not be sufficient. It requires better multi-level governance, involvement of national and regional government, building institutional capacities, greater access to finance and technology, climate education and public awareness, and of course, accelerated behavior change. Now, the interesting thing is we do possess the material basis, the policy solutions, and tools for these system changes. But the core question before us, as far as climate is concerned, and that's where cities are so central, is can we act fast enough? And that's where innovation in cities is going to be critical. So thank you very much. Kathy, I think we've lost your mic.
Oh, thank you so much. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, good.
Yes, yeah, we had a bit of a technology issue at this end, and sorry about that. But I was just thanking you very much for your presentation. Certainly, you bring a lot of information, but inspiration at the end. But obviously, highlighting the work that we have. And I was just saying that the summary for urban policymakers that I was privileged to be a part of, and as a city person to be in the room with the IPCC authors to unpack what does it mean for an urban policymakers. It was certainly an approach that we need to do more of, and Innovate for Cities of the Global Covenant of Mayors is focused on how do we get the knowledge to the cities in a way that means the most to them. And that I think all of the speakers have been talking about that. So now we're on to our final speaker for our session today. And we have Brian Motherway from the International Energy Agency, where he is the head of energy efficiency. The IEA is engaging globally on energy efficiency, delivering a range of analytical and outreach programs focused on impact and working to build a stronger understanding of how to deliver the full benefits of energy efficiency. Prior to joining the IEA, Brian was the Chief Executive of the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. And Brian holds degrees in engineering and a PhD in sociology, so certainly bringing together a lot of the discussions that we've already heard on the panel today. So I look forward to your presentation now on energy technology and cities. The floor is yours, Brian.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thanks to the organizers first and foremost for setting up this very interesting event, and to my fellow panelists for such great presentations leading up to this point. So you're all hard acts to follow, but I'll do my best. So I want to talk really about energy efficiency in cities and the context of clean energy transitions and decarbonization, and the role that cities and particularly innovation in cities is going to play in that. So in my next slide, we'll talk about the context, which is, of course, the unabated growth in CO2 emissions until now, when in 2020 we see a historically significant drop in CO2 emissions from energy, but of course for all the wrong reasons. The fall we're seeing this year is nothing to be celebrated, given that it's driven by people losing their health, losing their livelihoods, losing their economic resilience, and it is not something that we can build a decarbonization pathway on, or we wish to use as a model. And so the question is, of course, what comes next? Now, when we look at what is driving this drop in emissions in 2020, let me just focus on one sector, not the only relevant one, but I'll just focus on one, which is transport. And in the next slide, we can see that the drop in energy demand, in this case for gasoline and petrol in particular, and the consequent drop in emissions is of course driven by the lockdowns that happened at the end of the first quarter of this year all across the world. And you can see here that all cities were affected to more or less the same degree, going to close to zero or certainly 10% of their normal movement in cities. It's interesting to note, however, that there's quite a divergence in the patterns of recovery since then. Some cities, including my own here in Paris, have seen their transport mobility levels go back to almost normal. Others are still very close to zero. In the next slide, we can just look a little bit deeper at that and see that in certain regions, we can see the types of transport that have recovered well and the types of transport that have not recovered so well. And it's notable that certain leisure activities, such as going to parks, have seen an increase in mobility. Others are still well down on where they would normally be and where they were prior to this crisis. I would say in passing that this data is a new tool available to us, driven by innovation in digital technology in terms of data collection and analysis, and it empowers decision makers at every level to really look more deeply at what is happening and therefore what policy responses are required. Now, if I come to energy efficiency itself, energy efficiency progress is driven by investment. It's driven by investment in new buildings, in upgrading old buildings, in transport infrastructure, in transport vehicles, in all kinds of technology. And in the next slide, we see that there are understandable but nonetheless worrying trends in investment. In 2020, we expect investment in the whole energy system to fall by at least 20%. Of course, the most dramatic falls will be on the supply side in oil and gas, but in energy efficiency, we expect a 12% reduction in investment in all of those technologies, upgrades, new technologies, and replacement technologies that I mentioned earlier. And the absence of that driving force has quite significant impacts for our progress at a global, national, and city level in energy efficiency. So what is the response? Let's go to the next slide, please. The IEA has been working with governments to put forward a sustainable recovery plan where we can align the goals in the short term of economic recovery and job creation with the bigger picture goals around decarbonization, energy resilience, and sustainability of our clean energy systems of the future. Now, just putting that in perspective, you can see on this graph that there was a dip in CO2 emissions after the crisis of 2009 that was quickly wiped out by CO2 growth coming afterwards as economies recovered, investment recovered, and structural shift moved back towards more energy intensity and more emissions. Now, if we click again on that slide, please, we'll see that we do see a dip in 2020, as I mentioned, and the question is, what happens next? So if you click for me again, please, we will see that without the right kind of policy actions to make our recovery sustainable, it's inevitable that emissions will start to grow again as they have been doing so historically. However, if you click again, we can see the alternative, which is a sustainable recovery, where we properly align the immediate stimulus and job creation goals with longer-term decarbonization and clean energy goals. So on the next slide, let me go into just a little bit more detail about the IEA Sustainable Recovery Plan. which combines 3 imperatives. If we click once, just remind us that the imperative is to boost economies and to do so quickly and robustly. Click again, please, and we see the second component, which is to do with, if we could just click again, please. I have too many clicks on my slides. Thank you. Creating jobs, of course, and this is something I'll mention again. But of course, if we could click one more time, please. The third component of this circle is to do these other imperatives in a way that it improves the resilience of energy systems for the future and improves long-term sustainability. One more click, please, and we'll see where that investment will be driven. And we'll see in particular that energy efficiency drives 40% of the overall investment plan for the IEA Sustainable Recovery Plan. Next slide, please. This slide shows us why energy efficiency is so important, because you can see here the job multipliers for things like upgrading buildings, building new buildings, improving industrial energy efficiency, all have high job creation potentials per $1 million invested, while also locking in very significant and very valuable efficiency gains and therefore emissions reduction gains for the medium and the long term. Not only that, but many aspects of energy efficiency have the ability to be deployed more quickly. Programs driven by policy, driven by stimulus plans, driven by financial injections can be up and running within weeks and months rather than in years. And that's why we have a certain focus on energy efficiency and its particularly strong alignment between economic recovery goals and clean energy and decarbonization goals. Next slide, please. Since I put a bit of a focus here today on transport as an example, I just highlight that there are many actions in the transport sector that are very significant job creators in the short term, while also locking in better, more citizen-friendly, more sustainable infrastructure for the long term as part of cleaner, more resilient, and more sustainable cities of the future. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for cities? Well, I just really want to highlight 2 aspects of innovation that I think are going to be really important. First of all, innovation in governance. Because we are moving into a phase where the real urgency more than ever is on implementation and action, cities have a particularly important role in driving action on the ground and in translating international and national imperatives into real, meaningful and impactful action. It's particularly strong in buildings and transport, but it's also strong in the energy use of cities themselves through municipal services, street lighting, many other aspects. But one thing is clear, is this cannot be done by national governments on their own. And subnational governments are going to become only more important in the future in driving the kind of new policies and programs that will be required for this transition to succeed. The second innovation I want to talk about is technology, which is really enabling new and exciting things in all aspects of sustainable energy, but certainly none more so than in energy efficiency. Next slide, please. Digitalization is really changing how we think about energy in terms of matching supply and demand and how we think about the whole energy system as a system. In the past, we thought about energy systems in a very unidirectional way. We supplied energy, we moved it to where it was going to be used, and it was used. And systems were balanced usually by turning supply up and down. The demand for energy was largely taken as a given, and the job was to make sure that energy was supplied. That thinking is really changing fundamentally across the world today, and we are now starting to think about a much more dynamic, interactive and two-way conversation between supply and demand of energy, particularly in electricity and particularly in cities. Next slide, please. All of this is enabled by digitalization, whether it's the apps on our phone, smart meters in our homes, smart technology in our cars and in our buildings, in our workplaces. We are now able to have a conversation in the energy system in a dynamic way that looks at supply and demand, treats demand as a much more flexible resource, having much more local atoms of conversation between, let's say, rooftop solar, local renewable generation such as wind, and demand and the way we use energy and the way we build cleanliness, affordability and sustainability into our energy systems. And that empowerment by digitalization is a really exciting innovation that I think really opens very many opportunities for the future of energy systems, particularly at a city level and at a people level. Before I close, Kathy, I just want to mention that looking at this need for a stronger and more urgent action on energy efficiency, I want to mention a process, if we just go on a couple more slides, please, that we have been running for the last year in conjunction with a number of ministers and CEOs and thought leaders across the world. Next slide, please. Through a platform called the Global Commission for Urgent Action on Energy Efficiency, which has been working for the last year to think about the kind of actions governments can take to accelerate progress on urgent impacts of energy efficiency through policy action. Just recently, the Commission published its set of recommendations, which can be found on the IEA website, and you will see a very strong emphasis there on the relationship between national and subnational governments, the role of cities, the role of governance innovation, and the role of digital innovation. So it's a very exciting time for cities in energy efficiency, and we at the IEA are very pleased to be part of this conversation, to bring our data and our best practice sharing and our global connectivity to this conversation. And so I'm very pleased to be part of this event today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. You certainly spoke of many of the priority needs that cities have identified through the Innovate for Cities initiative that essentially came initially from the Cities and Climate Science Conference in Edmonton in 2018. And it's really excellent to see some of those knowledge gaps already starting to be filled by organisations such as yourselves, and bringing information like that to cities through events like this is really excellent. So thank you. So please, that's the end of our speakers. Please join me in thanking all of our speakers, and I believe they're all going to join me now for a last opportunity for some questions from the audience. Is that correct? Please, a round of virtual applause for fabulous presentations. Unfortunately, Philippe has had to leave early for another commitment, but certainly his presentation set the scene very well for us around the future of the cities and in particular technology. Certainly, as many of you mentioned, this is the last side event of the Mission Innovation Ministerial, and what a great opportunity to highlight the role and opportunity that cities have in the transition that is needed to meet the climate ambition of so many. So thank you very much. We have, I believe, about a good amount of time. Actually, you're all very punctual and stuck to time with your presentation to allow us about 10 or 15 minutes of questions from the audience. And while I wait for questions that to come through, and certainly I encourage, because I'm sure you've all actually picked up on something from each other's presentations that you might want to refer to. We don't need to be completely rigid in just hearing questions from myself, but I will kick off with a question while we wait for a question from the audience. Well, what I certainly picked up, obviously, is that transition is urgent, but it is feasible. And whilst resources are limited, and certainly cities are very much constrained at the moment, there is ambition still there, and we certainly don't need to look any further than the European Union for very strong ambition and targets. So my question is, and you've all been involved with a lot of cities and city networks through your work. My question is, so which partnerships are essential? What are the essential partnerships that cities need to focus on to really achieve their climate zero carbon strategies? And what can city leadership do to build those collaborations even further to drive that meaningful change? I know you all picked up on it, but how about I go to you, Patrick, first? Is that okay?
No, that's fine. No, and indeed, I think that one of the things that's really come out strongly from our mission board work on cities is that many of the technologies are there. There's some really great programs in different cities, in different places, but what perhaps we most need to do is to work on the overall governance. how do we make all the moving parts fit together? How do we empower city leaders to interact, to engage with the research community, their local universities, but also national authorities, the European level, to bring everything together into a genuinely joined up and results-oriented sort of governance model. And so we've been sort of talking around this concept of a sort of city contract, a sort of an agreement, not a legal agreement, but quite a clearly operational agreement, bringing in all the different stakeholders, including representatives of the bottom-up city citizens organizations, civil society, philanthropic groups, as well as associations like the Global Covenant. And we think that is, in many cases, the bit of the jigsaw which is missing, and where we can perhaps, with a bit of money or a bit of other political support, help to strengthen cities' capacities to exercise not only political leadership, but actually delivery of some of the things that need to be done. And so that's where we'll be looking.
And Kathy, just to come in and follow up, kind of riff off of what Patrick was just saying, I couldn't agree more. And I think that the next step that needs to happen around, we've seen over the last decade or two, organizations like City Networks come together and get really efficient and effective at what they're doing. Mm-hmm. But we still need now to have different groups of networks interlock. So exactly as Patrick said, bringing academia in, civil society, but it's also these networks of communities. So, example, going back to the ports thing that I was talking about, mm-hmm. There's a network of ports. There's 3 or 4 of them around the world. We need to bring the network of ports into the network of cities, into the Maritime Trade Association and the shipping industry to communicate. And that still isn't happening as frequently as you might expect. We refer to it kind of as everybody's familiar with silos and systems of thinking, which we all now know we need to kind of help break down. But thinking about it kind of like there's these vacuums. Oxygen doesn't exist between these. We're not incentivized, rewarded, or structured to bridge our gap or actor disciplines. And I think anything that we can collectively do to pump oxygen into that void to make it an environment that can sustain interaction is key. And everybody's crying out for it. We've done a significant amount of stakeholder engagement in the last year and a half. And this is what everybody's asking for. Bring us together. Let us talk to each other to understand each other's dependence. And to Patrick's point, governance is another big issue.
So just pick up on where Seth left out. I think, Kathy, you need sort of 3 forms of partnership. One, of course, is local partnerships that we just heard about, which brings in the local ecosystems to make things actually work there. And that's happening in many places, but it needs to be accelerated in a few thousand. So I think the European Union starting off with 100 is a good way of doing that, so that by 2024 you can really pick up and run with it, let's say. The second thing is a partnership between national governments and local governments. And this is going to be a tough one because we have 200 years of tension in that space. This cannot be implemented without that partnership. The national governments can't implement without local governments can't implement without power and money. So that's going to be a tough one in many places. But the final one is also the place where most institutional innovation is happening at the moment. And that is a partnership between cities, and bringing that together. And we've seen many networks, but I think we have to be a little bit ambitious in defining what success looks like. And I would say one element of success, and I'll be provocative here, is that within the next 2 or 3 years, we see the building of an international financial institution, which basically brings city demand and supply and resourcing together. So you need to do that, because if that doesn't happen, the money really doesn't flow to where it's needed on both the supply and the demand side, it's not going to work.
One I would add, Kathy, that maybe we haven't dwelt on is cities and business. And there's some very interesting innovative projects going on now with cities partnering with businesses, often in a triumvirate of maybe a city, an energy company, and a technology company, doing some really exciting pilots about smart technology, about sustainable cities, still at pilot level, but at growing scale, and really showing what new technologies and new ways of deploying them can do. And I think that really has a lot of potential, particularly as more businesses make that sustainability turn and think about where their futures are in the sustainable context, and seeing cities obviously as a driver of innovation and a driver of new markets in this regard.
So many threads here. I'm sure you all want to jump in, but I thought I'd take a nice segue from that. You started talking about innovation, and obviously mission innovation and Innovate for Cities in the Global Covenant of Mayors. Certainly we're trying to accelerate innovation in cities, and many of you spoke about great examples. So if you were going to, and you also spoke about resources being limited. So I'm interested in, if you were going to invest in innovation in cities, where would you put your greatest focus? It might be a tough question, sorry, but let's try. Who wants to go first? Seth? No, Patrick.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I love these types of questions, and I mean, on one hand, it's very hard, right? Because cities are significantly under-resourced around the world. Global North, Global South, resources in different contexts, different issues. So you could say they just need more of everything, and that wouldn't be too far off the truth. But to your more pointed question, which is where you would start, I guess there's a couple of ways I would answer that. One, I would say in a post-COVID world, one way to look at that is where we have some opportunities from some quick wins, and I think very much to one of the presentation that we saw, some of the work that IEA has been doing. There's a big task at hand to shift this towards a new sustainable path versus the the knee-jerk reaction, which is stimulus ready, shovel ready, let's get the economy going. And we've seen exactly how that's gone in the past. We've paved over pre-existing paved roads. So the need to kind of get the economy kickstart versus going back to 20th century solutions versus 21st century solutions is huge. So that's one, and that can be shaped by policy, and let's do this a little bit more intelligently. Two, I would also say I'm a big believer in the power of information and data. It was also described by many of us as real-time monitoring, smart solutions, etc. But the 21st century success is paved with data. And most cities, the truth is most cities are woefully behind. Again, most cities aren't even out of an analog processes of managing their data, let alone systemic, holistic, kind of creative, cost-effective solutions. And then I think the third area I would mention is look where those pockets of innovation currently sit. That's really one of the things that we're excited about, again, on the ports. There's been a massive amount of private sector R&D put into ports because of its unique governance structure, because of the focus of industry in the private sector. But what we're seeing is that investment is getting locked into those ports because the ports aren't operating holistically as a network across the coast, across the industry. So they've invested a bunch of money in technology and opportunities and policy in the ports, but not done it connected. And as a result, it's stuck. It's literally locked up. And we need to look at those types of examples throughout cities where we can make some adjustments and unleash what's already been happening.
Yeah, and if I could just carry on from that, I mean, I agree absolutely with Seth's first point. I mean, that the post-COVID recovery, I mean, there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of resources out there, but we need, as I think is the heart of the European recovery and resilience strategy, make sure that those investments are going to be genuinely green and genuinely digital, because this is the investment that we need to make in our collective future. And my answer to your question, I mean, not disagreeing with anything that Seth has said, of course, is having a look at social innovation. I mean, I was very struck that last year, the city that won the European Union's Innovative City Award was the city of Athens. And it wasn't because the city of Athens was able to produce a bigger fleet of hydrogen-powered buses than anywhere else, or because they had a new exciting approach to the smart grid prosumer, linking into local renewable energy sources. It was because of the bottom-up way that they had produced a whole sort of portfolio of innovative projects, in particular with the sort of green agenda in mind, at a time when the city administration was really suffering from the economic crisis in Greece, and they really had even less resources than most cities to work with. So the only solution for the local population was to come up with, these bottom-up ideas, which then they, got together. And so we gave them this European award because of their commitment to social innovation. And I think that's, it fits into this broader agenda of the socio-economic impacts of the green and digital transition, which are going to be, much bigger and much more sort of difficult to deal with at their human level than they are at the technological level.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I mean, this is something that we're talking about in the science and the IPCC community in particular, that, we've got all these technical transitions we described, but the challenging and, the one that will have the most impact is really the societal transition. It's a question of, how much is enough, how we can bring that together, how we can deliver well-being, and that happens really through a process of dialogue, and sometimes not having enough or being seriously challenged, being against, back against the wall is a good way to make that happen, like you're describing with Athens. But on the other hand, there's also this great sort of potential to lose the opportunity of these massive stimuli. I mean, we've just sort of helped design $250 billion stimulus, which is focused on urban areas for the government of India. And, India's, it's not a very rich country, but it's a large country. And that thinks very, very differently. So one of the challenges about the stimulus processes is they do not have a sense of space. So, they're sectorally oriented. So we need to spatialize them because, their priorities, things actually work better in some places rather than others. And if they're much better, then you have an increasing sort of, let's say, spatial inequality. So you've got to also deal with the places that are not so well off. And I guess in the EU, this is very clear because of transition states and a whole range of other things that are there. So I think one of the big challenges for us is really to internalize this idea of space and how we can link the infrastructures in the ports, in the airports, and activity in space. And that's a kind of new way of thinking, which is, national governments are not necessarily used to. And local governments don't necessarily have the ability to link up and connect, at least to the larger strategic infrastructures and processes.
In terms of where to start, Kathy, I think here in 2020, when so many cities, all cities are thinking about their resilience and their sustainability, including their financial sustainability, there are some early wins to do when we think about cities as energy users, because they are major energy users in their street lighting, in their water treatment, in their other municipal services. And there's some great investment opportunities to upgrade those kind of systems to be much more efficient, much more cost efficient and resilient. And to take the street lighting example, there's some great new technologies that use a fraction of the energy of traditional technologies. And India, for example, is a great case study in how that is being deployed right across the country using financial models where the capital is paid for by future savings. So it's actually doesn't even eat into the capital budgets of the cities. And so as well as just the financial gains of that and the environmental gains, it builds support for these kind of actions because it shows the immediate benefits, better lighting, better quality of life, lower costs for the cities. So there are these opportunities that are completely no regrets and a great place to start if you want to make a real dent, but also build support for the next phase.
And Kathy, I know you're going to lead us to another question. I just listening to all of this, I did want to just actually mention that a lot of what we've been picking up around flows and finance. Actually, there's a big announcement last week from the Global Covenant of Mayors on this new GAP fund, which is doing exactly this, trying to take money from national governments in programs and projects that are specifically targeted to cities and where they're stuck in terms of capacity building up front and shaping these future projects. So again, another great example of, I think, being on the right path and some experimentation.
Thank you for picking that up. I know I heard you all speaking. I was like, I think there was an event on such an inspirational, innovative. I think it started it started last week. But thank you for picking that up, Seth. That I was actually reminded. I was on a session last week and I was asked almost a similar question and about what is needed, and certainly inspiration. I think cities continually need inspiration to keep going forward. And I think, Brian, you certainly were highlighting you know, some of the innovation that cities are bringing forward that inspire other cities to do the same or similar, and certainly the city networks that many of you spoken about. I mean, that's one of the strengths of city networks, and even more so with this partnership with Mission Innovation. It is about inspiring all levels of government to do more and do better and move forward, obviously within the constraints and the restraints, you know, and the barriers, but innovation for sure. Now, oh gosh, I think that we've only got a few minutes left, but I really, this is probably challenging. You've got maybe 20 seconds each to give advice. So as I said, you know, the Global Covenant of Mayors and Mission Innovation, as we continue to work together, you know, what's your 30-second pitch for, you know, how we as local and national governments continue to put forward the case for rapid systems transition?
But if I can start, because I'll have to leave in a moment.
Yep.
My sort of top priority would be to, you know, try and surf the wave of this new idea that's coming out of the next generation of mission innovation, to try and develop a global level mission around the whole sort of energy transition in cities, and use the platform of mission innovation to give that really strong visibility and political leverage and ownership.
Seth?
I would say co-creation. National governments are more focused than ever before and understanding the challenges that we need to get to outlined by the IPCC in a 1.5 degree world. But co-creation upstream from the end users, i.e. the cities, is absolutely critical to figure out how that happens. And we're seeing seats open up at that table, but it needs to be accelerated.
Aroma?
You've got to get the right people into the right conversations. So the seat at the table is very, very important in this, along with making sure that the resource flows actually take place. And there's a deep problem in that architecture won't be easy to fix. But without that, the acceleration will be very, very challenging.
Brian?
I think it's beyond too late to be locking in any more inefficiency or carbon intensity into our infrastructure or our energy using assets. And therefore, I think I would encourage cities to be thinking about how can we use this crossroads we're at now in terms of the rethink and the reinvestment that is going to happen to really start building in the next generation of future-proof assets that will drive how we behave and how we use energy and how we emit carbon for many decades to come.
What a great way to end. Again, on inspiration. Unfortunately, we are at time. It always happens with an excellent session like this. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. And as I conclude this session, you know, I note, you know, we've heard during this session that cities are central to global efforts to tackle climate change, and the opportunities in urban transformation are significant, but the risks of not acting should not be underestimated. Urbanization during the 21st century will be a megatrend that shapes the future of our planet. And the issue is not simply one of looking at existing urban areas, but needs to encompass continuing rapid urban development and the pressures and challenges that this all brings and that we all face. The organizations that we've heard from today are working to understand and address various dimensions of these very complex issues. Innovation, research, development, deployment, scaling will all have a key role to play, and that cities, you know, cities need to lead this, but also their partners. And we've heard a lot about the partners that we need to work with. And platforms such as the Global Covenant of Mayors and Mission Innovation, we can work to bring the local, regional and national governments together, link them with academia, the private sector, civil society, to identify and overcome barriers to progress and encourage additional support at all levels. And these partnerships and the collaboration that they foster are essential for this global effort. We're really pleased and enthusiastically support the next phase of Mission Innovation and offer the Global Covenant of Mayors and all of our alliance partners and collaborators in this future endeavour. And I thank once again our speakers. Some have had to leave early, but what fabulous presentations, their time, their excellent contributions, not only tonight, but to, you know, the world that we need, and we need it much faster than ever before. Thank you so much again to the Mission Innovation team for the chance to discuss these issues and in the forum. And if you're certainly interested to learn more about the programs, you can follow us at Mayors for Climate. and reach us by email at info@globalcovenantofmayors.org. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Okay.